Hello, everyone. Hello again, I should say. I just did a presentation yesterday. For those who weren't here, though, my name is Xai'xais, which in my language means white bear. My other name is Neasloss, and I work as a stewardship director, but had a long life in tourism prior to stewardship in politics, and helped start up a business when I was about 17 years old in my community. We started out as a really two-man operation. And our Economic Development Corporation brought in a tourism expert at the time, partly because we had no experience in tourism. So we brought someone in. His job was to train someone in the community to become a guide, to run the business, and then phase himself out, which he did. And that's kind of how our business started. But before I get into that, just a bit about my community. Then there it is right there on the central coast of BC, right in the heart of the Great Bear Rainforest. A very small community, about 350 people, only accessible by boat or plane. So quite small. So just a bit of the history of my community. We have about 350 people there. We have a long history of fishing, and mostly very dependent on fishing. And so we used to have an old cannery back in the day. It started up in 1927, shut down in 1966. And that cannery employed about 100% of the people at the time. And when it shut down, it left us in a really bad spot. We were almost 90% unemployed for really since the 60s up until the 90s. And really the 90s was kind of the turning point for our community, because we probably had the highest suicide rate at that time. There was no hope for people and no jobs, no way for people to put bread on the table. I think just trying to attract any business to a remote area was extremely challenging. And in the 90s, at that time, the provincial government gave out a bunch of permits for all these companies to come and start logging the area. And like I said yesterday, our area wasn't known as the Great Bear Rainforest. It was known as the North Coast Timber Supply Area. And so I remember these forest companies coming into our community, and they came in, they called a community meeting, and they said, we'll promise you guys 100 jobs. And if we start knocking it down, we'll hire you guys, we'll build the roads. And there was a big community debate about what we do and how we move forward. And half the community entertained that because they wanted to put food on the table. The other half of the community said, absolutely not. We want to protect our food resources. We want to protect our old village sites, our cultural sites. And so there's a big community debate. And I remember at that time, all the environmental groups were up in our community. And so they all tied themselves to the trees. They shut down the whole forest operation. And I remember we had a series of meetings, and one day all the environmental groups came to our community. And we had a big, this photo is not in my community, this is a neighboring community, but same sort of story. There was a big debate about how we move forward. And I just remember a lot of my community members yelling at the environmental groups and asking them, are you going to feed our families? Are you going to, you're impacting the, our ability to create revenue for food on the table. And that's when I really started to think about how do we create revenue for our community that's not extractive, and there's got to be a way. And I remember out of this deal, our leadership at the time actually went over to one of the islands, and they asked the environmental groups to leave the territory, and so they did. But shortly after, I think the leadership felt bad because we're not loggers. We've never been loggers. We've always been fishermen, but we've never been loggers. And so Clem 2 at the time invited the environmental groups back to the table. We invited the forest companies back to the table. And we said, how do we develop a plan that's going to work for everyone? Forest companies want to log, environmental groups want protected areas, but our community wants both. We want to be able to create jobs for the people. We want to be able to protect some of these areas. And so at that time, there was a number of groups involved, groups like the Hewlett-Packard Foundation, the Moore Foundation, the Nature Conservancy. A number of groups basically went down and said, well, we can go and fundraise money. This is when they started to create the Coast Opportunities Fund. But basically, they went down and fundraised $60 million. And that was going to be put into an endowment fund. And the return on investment would be about 4 to 6%. So this basically allowed our communities to start developing stewardship offices. And so the money came online around 2007. And basically the formula for that was small communities get 250,000, large communities get about 500,000, and that's at the lower end. And so last few years we've been getting a lot more. And this really helped change a lot for our stewardship side. But the environmental group said, we won't give you guys the money unless the feds and the province match that money. And so the federal government, provincial government came and matched that money and created an economic fund or a stimulus package in a way. And so the $60 million was going to be drawn down. But this money was split amongst 27 First Nations communities, and basically the formula was based on how much territory you protected, and it was also based on the size of your community. So every community got a few $1,000,000, and my little community got about $4.5 million. So kind of gave us an opportunity to kind of jumpstart business in our community, and that was really important. So this is what the protected areas came out to look like. Again, about 85% of the Great Bear Rainforest is locked up in some sort of protected area. And in my community and in my territory, about 55% of it is now locked up in protected areas, which is great. That meant a lot of those areas could not be logged. And the rest of the area could be logged under this new model called ecosystem-based management. And we're protecting a whole bunch of values, whether it's wildlife or cultural values. And so we work with all the companies. And we also developed something that was really important called a reconciliation agreement. And that was an agreement with the government on how we work together, on how companies do business in our territory. And so part of that agreement was Schedule D, which is more focused on the economics. And in Schedule D, it says First Nations will get equitable access and First Nations will get enhanced economic opportunities. And so nobody ever defined that. So we set out to start trying to identify that as we were trying to build our tourism business. And so, and I'll touch on that a bit later and explain that a bit more. But nonetheless, we started tourism. We actually started tourism in the late 90s, and we were trying to slowly build the business. Again, the Coast Opportunities Fund wasn't really available yet when we first started. But we had BC Ferries start to come to our community. And BC Ferries was the first time we had ferry access, and all the tourism consultants at that time said, BC Ferries is going to be massive for your community. You're going to get flooded by all these tourists coming to your town, and be prepared for that. And so we, started to prepare. We tried to hire some tour guides and hire some chefs, and we started trying to do these walking tours. And sometimes we'd hire 10 guides, and sometimes only 2 people would book off of BC Ferries. And so we were spending more money than we were making at that time, and so it was just a losing proposition. And so we decided to shift our focus. And then all the tourism consultants said, kayaking is going to be massive. They said, all these kayakers are going to flood your town. Be prepared because it's coming. And so we brushed out all these campsites. We invested in kayaks and a lot of the infrastructure. And then nobody came. So, and the people that did come, we found out pretty quick that kayakers are the cheapest people on the planet. And they would bring their own kayaks, they would bring their own food, and they would just hire a guide. And so, but the kayak industry was also really brutal at that time. They were slashing prices on each other. And it got to the point, just to stay competitive, we were almost giving away trips. We were breaking even, and it just wasn't a good business model. But nonetheless, I was a kayak guide for about 5 years, and it was super funny because I'd never been in a kayak in my life. And so now I'm trying to kayak with these clients, and I almost all the time have to tell these guys, slow down, wait for me, let me catch up. And so, so anyways, we did that for a few years, and we realized that wasn't the right market. So we decided to shift out of that. Everybody said cultural tours, that's where the money is, that's where you got to go invest. And we had hundreds of cultural sites in our territory. We have, an old big house, we have watch poles, we have pictographs, petroglyphs. Again, super challenging. We could not seem to put bums in the seat. And if you know anything about tourism, you need a certain amount of people to run your vessel just to break even. And but we were really struggling for quite a number of years. And then we decided to shift more into the wildlife. So again, this is fairly in our infant stages that we're going through all of these massive changes in tourism, and as we slowly started to grow it, we started to run into some community concern around tourism. And the community was very worried about tourism, and they didn't understand it. Nobody had ever seen it before, And so we had a lot of questions from the community. And at that time, our leadership did not support our tourism operation. So our band council was trying to shut it down. And so it made it really tricky. But a lot of the community started to ask, are we going to have all these tourists in our community looking in our window? Are they going to be buying out all the food at our band store? And so that was a big worry. And probably the biggest question I got is, am I selling my culture? And I remember we had a community vote, and the leadership was really pushing to shut it down. And I just remember we had this big battle in our community. And we just said, listen, you can no longer make a living fishing on the coast. Unless you're stacking licenses, you could no longer make a living fishing. We just protected half our territory in forestry. So we chopped off a huge economic arm by protecting our territory. So we could no longer log those areas, which was fine. But we said we need to carve a future for ourselves. The new generation, the young generation, needs to find out where we're going to go and what we're going to do. And to me, we were pushing super hard, so we got up and we're begging the community to say, you know, we have the beauty, we have the culture, we have the wildlife. Anyways, the meeting was going sideways. It looked like the community was going to vote no. It didn't look like they were going to support it at all. But this lady I put up in the picture, this elderly lady, her name is Violet. She was in her late 90s, and she was the last lady on the planet that spoke a southern dialect of Tsimshian called Xai'xais. And she was a highly respected lady, one of our hereditary chiefs in our community. And she got up in front of the community and she said, listen, our young people are becoming very disconnected. They're not learning their land, they're not learning their stories, they're not learning their songs, they're not learning their dances. And she said, if tourism is going to be a vehicle to help drive that, she says, I think we should entertain this. You know, I think that we need to get people out there again. And nobody spoke against her. She essentially made the decision by herself that night and saved our tourism operation. And I'm so grateful that she was there and said that. But she came to me at the end of the meeting and she started to point to my face and she said, if you're going to do tourism, she said, don't bullshit. And know your stuff and represent your people. And she said, it's not just about business, but take your people, make sure the youth are involved, make sure your community is involved. And so, and that was really huge for our operation. So that was kind of the first time we kind of got the green light to start moving ahead with kind of full-scale tourism. So we started our tourism in the early days. We called our company Clem2 Tourism because, I mean, I guess we weren't too creative back then, but that's what we called our operation. And really small operation. Again, we hired that tourism expert. His job was to kind of build some capacity within the community. We had a tiny little boat, 18-foot vessel that would cram 6 people on. We had a tiny accommodation, which is in the middle, a little float house. We'd cram 6 people in that as well. And we did a lot of those kayak tours. And I remember in about 2005, the tourism expert gave me the keys to the operation and said, I'm out. My job was to phase myself out of this business. I think you have enough to run it. And so he gave me the keys and said, sink or swim. And but he said, if you're going to survive, you have to get into the wholesale market. He says that's the only way Clem2 Tourism will survive. And so I phoned, he gave me the 2 companies, Rendezvous Canada and Canada's West. Those are the 2 big trade shows. And so I remember I phoned them and I said, listen, how do we get in your show? And they said, well, you have to be in business for 10 years before we accept you. And we were only in business for 5 years at that point. And so I must have phoned them about 100 times until they gave up and they gave me the little tag to get into their show. And basically it was like a speed dating session. You got 5 minutes to pitch your product and they got 5 minutes to decide whether they like it and whether they book you. And so these were wholesalers from all over the world. You had Europe, you had Australia, you had China. And so I was pretty young and naive, I guess, at that time, but I remember I circled a few people on that list that I wanted to meet with, and one of them was China. And I thought, man, these guys got like 1 billion people there, so this has got to, they'll book our seats, no problem. And we were really struggling at that point just to fill all of our seats. And so after I pitched my heart out to China, and they said, do you have buses that go to your city? And I said, no. I said, we're not a city. And she says, okay, do you have buses that go to your town? I said, no. She said, okay, we're not interested. I'm like, okay, well, that ends that. So I had the next guy circled on my list, and this guy, he came with some really high recommendations. This guy brings over tons of people to Canada. So same thing, I get up there and I pitch my product, talk about the beauty and the wildlife and the culture, And after I was finished my 5 minutes, this guy just looks at me and he says, listen, no one wants to do business with you Indians. You Indians start up a business and you shut down the year after. You Indians don't show up on time. Your quality of food is not there. Your quality of accommodation is not there. Your vessels aren't there. Fix this, change your name, all these things. And I was like, wow, that's probably the most blunt response I've ever heard. So I was quite upset about it, and I was getting ready. Oh no! So I asked him. I said, "Well, how do we get in your books? What do we got to do to get in your books?" And he said, "Change this, fix that, don't do this, you know." And he gave me all these things, and so I was getting ready to walk away. I was super upset. And the guy says, "Wait a minute! Before you go, I just want to tell you guys are peanuts. You're talking half a dozen people, and I bring over thousands of people to Canada." He said, "Triple your capacity, maybe then you'll be interesting." And so I walked away very upset. So I went back to Clem 2, and I went and had a chat with our leadership at the time, and our dev, and I thought about what the guy had to say. Everything he said was right. Everything he said was absolutely true, that we were not running a good business, that we had this tiny little vessel that we used to cram 6 people on, tiny accommodation. We spent $0 on marketing. The only marketing we'd spend is trying to give people these free trips so they could write a story on us. That's where we got that story, that kayak story. But we didn't spend any. We didn't put the time and effort. And cooks as well. Like I used to be the cook, and I can't even eat my own cooking half the time. So I always remember one time we hired an elder in our community to do some of the cooking, and I was trying to get out of it because I was doing all the different, running the business and boat operator sometimes and tour guide, and we hired this elder, and we just moved to these new forms, dietary requests. They'd write down all their diet, and so this elder phoned me one day, and she says, "Well, what the hell's a vegan?" And I said, "I have no idea." So we were sitting there looking in the dictionary trying to find out what a vegan was, and the rest of her form said she was allergic to soy and allergic to wheat. So we go to our band store and we looked at the ingredients, and everything had soy and everything had wheat. And so this elder says, "I quit." And I'm like, "No, you can't quit. They're coming tomorrow." So I just remember we had to charter this plane of special food for this lady that couldn't eat, vegan. And so I just remember after this trip, it was such a hassle dealing with that. It was kind of our first time running into these sort of special dietary things. We were ready to ban all vegans and vegetarians from our tours, and so so another thing I just want to talk about was the branding. And so we went back to Clem 2, and we had a big discussion about how do we move to the next phase of tourism, because we can't continue to operate under Clem 2 tourism. We need to really beef this up and really invest some money into it. And so we knew the Coast Opportunities Fund was coming. We knew that this could be something that we could invest in. So the first thing we want to do is change our name, to get rid of this name, Clem 2 Tourism. And why I say that is, I got 1 minute left. So yeah, branding was super important. So we decided to shift out of this name, Clem 2 Tourism. And so we hired this guy who used to work for Marlboro Cigarettes and Coca-Cola and all these major companies. And so we came up with a new name, and we want to look at a new logo. And this is actually kind of inspired by WWF logo, or the World Wildlife Fund logo. So that's kind of where our first design, but we wanted to make it look like it was First Nations, representing the First Nations. And so we looked at this and we developed it, and we called it Spirit Bear Adventures. And so we put a lot of time and effort, and we thought this is perfect. This represents our name, it represents what we do. We're walking on bear trails, we're taking people from all around the world, and we just thought it was perfect. But another thing we wanted to do is we wanted to hire a marketer, someone who had some instant credibility in that wholesale market. And we went after one guy, amazing marketer, but he said, "If you're going to hire me, I want the flexibility to make change." And we didn't know what that looked like. We said, okay. And the first day on the job, he said, "I'm going to change the name of the business." And I'm like, "Are you shitting me? We just changed the name of the business." And if you know anything about business, when you change the name, it could be the death of your business. And so you want to develop that brand, and so, and he said to me, "Who are the people that have money?" And he said, "It's retired people. You have to go after those retirees, because those are the ones that will come and book your product." But he said, if you use the word adventure or the word safari, it's going to chase those old people away. And so he said, "I'm going to change the name." And he said, "I'm going to call it Spirit Bear Lodge. And we're going to market a lodge experience and do day trips out of this lodge." And the moment he did that, the next year we doubled in business. And so we didn't have the money to pay this new marketer and manager for our lodge. So we told him that, listen, we'll pay you based on how much you grow the business. So we paid him low at first, and the more he grew the business, the more he got paid. And so that's how we based his salary. And so we went from about a $100,000 company to next year doing $200,000. Then next year was $200,000 to $400,000, $400,000 to $800,000. And every year we doubled in business, and it worked out super well. We ended up building, now that the Coast Opportunities Fund came online, we decided to get rid of that little shack that we used to cram 6 people in, and we built Spirit Bear Lodge. This hotel now could accommodate 24 people. We bought a fleet of vessels. We started to invest in building capacity within our community, training new tour guides, new boat operators, chefs, hotel staff, and really started to just grow the business. And so that's one of the photos right on the oceanfront view is Spirit Bear Lodge. Totally changed our whole business by having that. Here's just a few more photos. That's inside one of the bedrooms. And so, yeah, we purely started to focus mostly on wildlife tours with a cultural component to that. I would say today the business has done extremely well. Right now, we hire about 40 people in Spirit Bear Lodge. We just broke the $2.5 million mark. We pay out about $500,000 in staff every year, in salary to our staff. And more often than not, we're sold out 2 years in advance now. And so it's totally changed our community. And I would say today, I mean, looking back in the 90s when we were almost 90% unemployed, today we're about 95% employed now. We actually struggle trying to fill the jobs we're trying to create, which is really good. But a big part of that is tourism. It's now the second biggest industry, and we hope it'll be the biggest industry, and that we can really scale down on extractive type of industries. And so, yeah, I think I'll leave it there. But just before I end, though, I just want to congratulate all of you guys for your work here, and that's something I didn't say yesterday. You know, I've been working on Indigenous protected areas for quite some time and trying to develop a new model in British Columbia. Super excited to see the work you guys are doing here, and I just think you guys will be leading the way in a lot of ways. So I'll end it there. Thank you.